Put up a
Okay.
weather map. We can put a weather map behind you. You can point out the daily.
So I guess we can go ahead. Okay. All right, so welcome to the virtual winter reading program kickoff for adults for the North Carolina Library for the Blind and Physically Handicapped. I'm Catherine Rubin, the Assistant Regional Librarian. And in today's program, library patron Bill Steppen will give you a fascinating history of the United States Postal Service, featuring the audiobook in our collection, How Our Post Office Created America, by Winifred Gallagher. First, a few housekeeping matters. Please note that this program will be recorded in video, and there will also be a separate audio recording. Our basic agenda is for Bill to do his presentation, and afterwards he will take questions from the audience. Sarah Brackett will track the order of the questions and handle that portion of the program. Bill will be presenting PowerPoint slides, but he will also describe them for the audience. If you have a question, you can type it in the chat box at any time by clicking the chat option in the bottom middle of the Zoom screen. It will be answered during the question and answer session. You will be muted when the program starts, so we won't get background noises like side conversations or phones ringing, or in my case, dogs howling. During the question and answer time, if you have a question, please just raise your hand and you will be unmuted when it's your turn to ask your question. You can also ask questions by selecting the Zoom raise hand option. If you're calling in by an old-fashioned landline phone, not a smartphone loaded with Zoom, use *6 to mute or unmute yourself. Use *9 to raise your hand to ask a question. So first, I'd like to introduce Susan Forbes, the Assistant State Librarian.
Thanks, Catherine. First, I'd like to welcome everyone to this event to kick off the library's winter reading program. Thank you all for being here today. We really appreciate all the library's patrons and supporters, and I hope you'll enjoy today's presentation and the winter reading program. Also, many thanks to Catherine, Clint, and Carl, and all the great staff at the library for organizing in this event and for all that you do every day to enrich the lives of North Carolinians who use your services. I'm really looking forward to hearing Mr. Steppen's talk. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and speaking with us.
Thanks, Susan. So, and now we will have our Regional Librarian Carl Keene here to welcome you.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm Carl Keene. I'm the director for the North Carolina Library for the Blind and Physically Handicapped. And on behalf of our library, as well as the State Library of North Carolina, I'd like to welcome you to today's program. This is a first for us. About 3 years ago, we did a hybrid combination of live and virtual programming when we did a cooking program at Governor Moorhead School. This is our first total virtual program, and we're very happy that you could join us today for it. At this time, I'll turn the presentation over to Catherine, who will introduce our speaker.
Okay, thanks, Carl. For more than 50 years, Bill Steppen has been a history teacher, writer, educational consultant, and storyteller. He taught history in middle and high schools in both Illinois and North Carolina. While teaching, Bill was an author for a K-7 social studies series and a popular Illinois state history book. As founder of Human Learning Resources Incorporated, Bill trained teachers across the U.S. in ways to help their students develop critical thinking skills. For the past 3 years, Mr. Steppen has been blending a storytelling style with history topics through a program titled History's Mysteries to help history come alive again for adult audiences. Bill is no stranger to the North Carolina Library for the Blind. He's been a patron for more than 10 years, often using the library to research topics for his presentations. So thank you for being here, Bill, and you can go ahead and start.
Well, thank you, Catherine. I appreciate that. The next time you do an introduction, I'm going to leave off the 50 years part and not let anybody know just how long I've been toiling in the classroom. But it's never been a toil because history just fascinates me. The only trouble with history is the way we teach it. Too often we just put a bunch of facts together and put it in front of young people and older folks, and then we expect them to remember it probably just long enough to pass a quiz or a test. And I don't think that does history its service. If you look at the word history, think about this. In the middle of the word history is the word story. And that's why my wife, Abby, who's seated next to me, and I became so interested in really turning history over to the storyteller art. Because in telling stories, we use words to bring experience and bring discovery to the listener. And that's what I think we should be doing more in education. And that's why about 3 years ago, we began to do it as a special program for the Mecklenburg County Library and for organizations in Charlotte, where we could appear in front of them and do face-to-face. And now we do it through Zoom presentations like this one. But in any case, what we want to do with this approach is we want to allow you to have a chance to discover some stuff about the topic that we're working with this particular month and stuff that you might not have thought about before. And it becomes a discovery. It becomes kind of the unfolding of some mysteries even that we didn't even know were a part of our history here in America. So that's what we're doing in this kind of program called History's Mysteries. Sometimes the programs have actual mysteries, things that are still undecided or unanswered in American history, such as the Alcatraz escape and well, any number of them. I'm not going to tip our hat as to what could be coming in the future. But in any case, what we're going to do today is we're going to explore a topic that maybe not many people in our audience have thought about as being a vital part of the way America's history has unfolded. And that's the role of the post office in creating this country. So think about for a second before we get started with the slides, think about, for an example, some of the things you think about as being the really important factors in American history. Think of people, think of events, maybe conflicts, think of laws. And I'll bet in your list, you probably didn't put the post office. But there is a wonderful book in the North Carolina system that we'll refer to at the end of the presentation and take a peek at it, that talks all about the impact of the post office on helping create the America that we enjoy today. And so that's what we're going to be dealing with. Okay, now on our screen, under the title, we've got a couple of slides. One is of an old, early 1900s truck, and on the side of it says, "Save time, get a mailbox." Now, wait a minute, you mean there was an America without mailboxes? How could that be? And then on the right-hand screen, there's a bunch of rural post office or mailboxes rather on sticks, on boards, along a roadside. Where I grew up in Illinois, just outside of Chicago, believe it or not, over 50 years ago, we had mailboxes like that, and we could still see skyscrapers in the horizon. So quite an interesting development of the post office. But now let's go ahead and take a look at how this post office evolved and how it helped America evolve. So let's go back to the beginning. Now, I don't mean just the beginning of the US. Let's go back, way back to the beginning of mail. Okay, we see some young lads over here in a slide, three of them carrying a couple of branches on their shoulders. And hanging from those branches are a couple of boxes. And what's inside those boxes is what was mail at the time of the pharaoh's rule in Egypt. And what's inside those boxes being carried by these couriers are really just papyrus rolled. Papyrus, you know, is a plant, grew along the Nile area where there was plenty of moisture still in the ground. That papyrus was cut, the inside was scooped out, it was pounded out into a flat material, and then it was pushed together with similar kind of pieces of flat material to create a writing surface. Very rough, very primitive, but onto that surface could be written decrees, especially because mail wasn't for everybody. It was for women's service. And so the pharaohs used the courier service, these fellas running these boxes from place to place around Egypt. And inside those boxes, decrees from the pharaoh or from other government officials contained on papyrus. Now in Persia, not very far from Egypt, riders would carry these, maybe because of the greater distance that they had to cover, but maybe also to pick the speed up a little bit. And runners also ran official business like these fellows are running in this picture. And what was fascinating to learn about was that these fellows that were carrying these decrees back and forth across Persia, across Europe, were also gathering intelligence. They were probably the first set of spies being employed by governments anywhere in the world, maybe also to include China at the time, which had a similar system to these. But these fellows would keep their eyes open. They would gather information about what's going on in the hinterlands of Egypt or in Persia, and then bring it back to government officials after they've dropped off their papyrus load and maybe brought more messages back to the rulers. Now, England and France allowed citizens many, many years later to begin to use the mail, but the citizens had to pay the freight. They had to pay the cost of whatever it might be to carry parchment or vellum communications, sheets of material back and forth between friends or on business. Very expensive proposition. Post office or the postal service, the mail, was not intended for use by average citizens. Now, what about in the American colonies? What about us? Well, when we were discovered, when we were explored, when we were settled, pretty soon England began to set up its colonial structure, its colonies, and within each of the colonies, a post office of some sort was established, mostly for a site where material from England could be delivered into the colonies. Okay, in Boston was the first post office for the American colonies, and its purpose was to just be there and take the mail off the ships as it would arrive from England. And the mail was intended then too, primarily for the governor of the colony and for officials in the colony. Now, just to set a little perspective, Salisbury, North Carolina is not far from Charlotte. If I wanted to get mail at that time from Boston here to North Carolina, it would take me about 25 days. Okay, mostly along the seacoast, of course, and mostly by a rider on horseback. It was faster for a ship to deliver mail from England to Boston, 21 days, than it would take for that mail to get from Boston here to North Carolina. Why? Because the slide that's up on your screen right now shows a pathway through the forest. And the pathway is about 4-5 feet wide, just ground dirt caused by traffic, foot traffic and horse traffic, maybe wagon traffic. And that picture that's on your screen is what in the early days was known as a post road. It was a road that was carved through wilderness so that mail could be brought from place to place. Those are called post roads. And who used them? Well, if you wanted to get mail to a friend, You would ask a friend to take it if they were passing by a friend of yours living in some other part of the state. And that friend, wandering over to on his or her journey, would drop it off at your friend's house. That was the extent of the postal service as you and I could have used it. Now, even Native Americans in colonial days, who had an excellent sense, of course, of the geography of the area, were asked and agreed to deliver letters in exchange for supplies, in exchange for goods that they could use, and even exchange for money. Now, Ben Franklin, a name you probably recognize pretty quickly, became one of our first postmasters in the colonies, employed by the English government, until, of course, he became involved in the Revolutionary movement, and then they stripped him of his position as postmaster. But he was probably the best known original or one of the first postmasters in the country. We see the postal road, and we also will take a look in just 1 minute here at what early post offices look like. I think you'll be a little surprised, but post offices were not sophisticated. You probably have visited a post office, noticed how, it's a very usually a typical government building, pretty extensive, pretty far flung and so forth, but not in the colonies. Why? Because the colonists in the early American colonies in the early 1700s were sending only about 1 letter per family per year. So what's the need to have any kind of elaborate postal system? Well, let's take a look at this slide of a picture of a post office. This one happens to be in Charleston, South Carolina. And I've titled a bunch of these slides by impact. Impact number 1, impact number 2. Because I want to kind of identify the things that the post office did to shape America. And this first one is just absolutely critical. Impact number 1, a democratic republic. Now, the US Constitution was passed in 1787. And what it did is set up in our country, one of the first places in the world, a democratic republic. A republic run by you and I, okay? And in that Constitution was mentioned specifically that we would have a post office and we would maintain postal roads so that that mail could get from place to place. And why is that important? Well, think about this. We are going to be a popular sovereignty. We're going to be run by the citizens of our country. It says that in the first line of the Constitution. We, the people, are going to make this whole thing work. Okay? So, post offices, well, in 1793, that's only 6 years after the Constitution was written, there were 75 post offices in the United States. That's a pretty impactful number. But move up only 8 more years to 1801, there are now 903 post offices around the country. Why? Because the federal government determined, as did state governments, that any community could have a post office. And that would put you in the network of information flow around the country. Okay? So we're going to look at that a little more deeply. But first of all, I want to take a look at this first post office a little more clearly. In the picture, you see a 3-story a post office building. It's a 3-story building. It doesn't say post office on there anywhere. Why? Because that wasn't its primary purpose. On the first floor, there's a doorway, a couple of windows, and behind that doorway was a tavern. Post offices were very, very often placed in public buildings. Where did people go? Where did they congregate? Maybe it was in a store. Maybe it was in a tavern. Maybe it was in a restaurant. Maybe it was in a hotel, a simple hotel. Now, this particular building had everything going for it that a frontier or colonial post office would have. On the first floor was the tavern. So there were people in the building all the time. That was important because you went to collect your mail at the post office. Mail was not delivered to your home or to any place else. So you went in there to get your mail. Now, the second floor above there was probably a couple of hotel rooms. Sure, there would be visitors to Charleston who would want to stay in the hotel room, but more importantly than that, that building was a stagecoach stop. Much of the mail, much of the larger bulk of mail was carried by stagecoach or some kind of coach. And when the drivers and the passengers in the stagecoach would arrive in Charleston to stay overnight in some cases before they move on to Savannah or someplace up or up the North Carolina coast, let's say, those hotel rooms up there were rented to the passengers on that stagecoach, while the owner of the tavern, the postmaster usually, would take the mail out of that coach and put it into mail slots on the bottom floor. Now, what's the third floor for? Well, the guy who owns the post office had to have someplace to live. This was probably his building, his tavern. He and his family used the top floor usually for their residence. Okay? Now then, I put a quote from Ben Franklin up at the top of this next slide. A republic, if you can keep it. What Franklin was concerned about is that in the early colonies, we were so separated, we were so much in the beginning of the creation of a country that it was a tough proposition to believe that we could actually keep this democratic republic, keep it democratic, keep it a republic. And so in that print shop that Ben Franklin used to run, he was producing probably the most important piece of mail the new country would ever produce, okay? The republic would require informed citizens, because we, the informed citizens, would be making choices. We would be the ones who would be running this new endeavor called the United States. And so how would we get educated about what's going on? It would be through newspapers. And newspapers, of course, were a major part of Ben Franklin's trade. Now, newspapers, to be sent through the mail to whoever would like to receive the newspaper, would be anywhere from a penny to 25 cents. A penny for the broadside, the big one sheet of newspaper, printed usually on both sides. Now, if you wanted the newspaper and you lived quite a ways away from a town, it might cost you a little more because distance made a difference. When the postmaster assigned the cost to a piece of mail, it was not only by weight, it was assigned by the distance that it traveled. Okay? Newspapers took up 70% of the mail that was being transferred and transmitted across the country. 70%. In 1788, there were 150 newspapers in our country. They were all making use of the mail service in one way or another. Okay? About 40 years later, there were 1,200 newspapers. And the newspaper published in Boston or New York or Philadelphia could be received at the Mississippi River by that early date already. How did it get there? By postal service. So, it's curious to me, as I was kind of checking out some of these statistics to put the presentation together too, I was curious as to whether our mother country, England, who was so sophisticated and so smart at that time, how did they compare with us, the number of newspapers that were published? Well, by 1830, we actually had twice as many newspapers in the United States as England was publishing within its country. We had the best informed citizens in the world by the early 1800s. mostly because anybody could get their hands on a newspaper, and also, of course, because we decided that we would educate kids in schools for at least a few years so they could get to read, to write, and do some of that arithmetic stuff. Now this slide has a couple of very small portions to it, so I'll describe them as best I can. Remember, the first impact that we talked about was the impact of deciding that we were going to be a democratic republic, and the role the newspaper would have, and the postal system in keeping that democratic republic. The second impact by the Postal Service was that it would support expansion of our people and keep us in contact, connected with one another and connected to the country. And how would we do it? Well, in the early 1800s, the primary way to get mail around our country is shown in these four little pictures, and let me describe it. In the upper left-hand side, we see a fella on a horse, riding on a post road, probably somewhere between settlements, very widely separated usually by forest. That's the primary way that mail was carried in the earliest days. But things changed a little bit. If you look in the right-hand corner, we see a steamship. The rivers of America were considered postal roads, post roads, because mail was carried on them. And that steamboat that you see right there in the upper right-hand corner, you can bet it was loaded with mail. Because when it dropped passengers off at docks, when it dropped cotton off at docks, when it dropped off any other material it was carrying, it also dropped off bags of mail. And that steamship not only carried the mail, it was in part subsidized by postal contracts. So it could run its course and repair the boats and do all the rest of that because the post office was paying part of the cost of all of that operation. Drop down and you see the stagecoach with the passengers on board it, and probably going across it looks like a kind of a Western motif. There are very few trees in the picture. Again, that wagon, that coach, was not only carrying passengers, there were bags of mail on that coach, and that coach was subsidized in part by the U.S. Post Office. And guess what? We've got the railroads on the left-hand side over here. The railroads became the primary carrier of the mail for years and years and years, until we'll see about some technologies that replace it. But it too was carrying U.S. mail aboard that train, and those trains were getting U.S. Post Office contracts in order to carry that mail. So in 1800, about 10% of us lived west of the Appalachian Mountains. You know the Appalachians run all the way from Maine to Mississippi. Okay, quite a fence of mountains right down through the original colonies and the colonies that sprung up right after the original colony. Okay, by 1850, 30% of us lived on the western side of those mountains. And you know what? Mail service kept those people connected regardless of what side of the mountains they lived on. So there was no hesitation to move west because you didn't have to lose contact with friends and family in the east. The mail would keep you connected. You didn't have to worry about that. And businesses could expand and not lose contact with banks in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Charlotte, North Carolina, Salisbury, North Carolina, wherever your bank was at. So 50% of us moved every 10 years. We were the fastest expanding population in the world throughout the 1800s. Riders, boats, stagecoaches, steamships, and trains all carried that mail. And I'm going to read you some statistics off the bottom of this slide. In 1800, okay, just what, 15 years or so after our founding, there were 20,000 miles of post roads, and there were over 900 post offices. 12 years later, there were twice as many miles of post roads. And we've gone from 900 post offices to 2,600 post offices. And only 8 years later, we doubled the amount of roads again, over 72,000 road miles of post roads and 4,500 post offices. The expansion was fantastic, and it kept us connected. It allowed the country to grow and expand without losing its connections. Now, some of these connections, we talked about stagecoaches and riders, but I want to tell you about one that we don't hear about much anymore. It's called the optical telegraph. Okay, and yeah, this was a way of sending communications that did not require the post office. In France, in the middle 1700s, a Frenchman came up with the idea of what if we put up towers, and one tower within sight of the other, even by a little kind of telescope, and we could send up messages in one tower by semaphore. We could put up flag messages. I don't know how they got that calculation, but I just thought it was cool. Okay. So what about the US? Did we do it? Not too much, because by the time we were looking for long distance communication like this, we had the railroad beginning to take shape. The electric telegraph was going to come into being pretty soon. But one place where it did show up was on the West Coast in California, where a number of towers were built with semaphore on it, so that the observers could send back to the city the fact that they had located a ship coming to port. So it was used to identify ships. And by the way, the biggest port on the West Coast, San Francisco, Primary Hill in downtown San Francisco, Telegraph Hill. Why? That was the site of one of these towers. Okay, so we are expanding. The post offices are expanding. They're keeping us in contact, allowing us to keep moving and moving and moving. And also, the post office made itself available, not only by the fact that it expanded, but by the fact that it kept costs down. You and I could afford to send messages, letters back and forth to friends, not just for business reasons, because the post office was mandated by Congress to keep costs low so the public could use it. Okay. Now, the post office we see right here is in rural Indiana. And it's very typical of that post office like we saw in Charleston. This one only a 2-floor, probably a little general store on the first flight. Upstairs above that might have been a room or two for stagecoach passengers to stay the night, or for the owners to stay. And here's the way a post office ran itself back here in the 1800s. Stop by, pick up, and pay for your mail. Okay, it went this way. Okay, if you wanted to write a letter, you got a piece of paper, you wrote on it, you folded it up, you glued it. Okay, you took it to the post office, and you wrote on there a description of the location you wanted it to go to. Usually the person's name, because there were no addresses to get this stuff going out to people in one place or another. The post offices had to know who the person was, and then the delivering post office, or the post office where the letter would be delivered, had to be able to put it in a slot with that person's name on it. Okay, so you folded the letter, you glued it, you took it to the post office. The postmaster or the clerk weighed it, routed it to the next post office. Okay, hand sorted it, and then delivered it to a local, or where it was hand sorted. It was then delivered to another post office near where that person lived, in the town usually. Okay, it was put in a slot on the wall, and the person would come in, you or I would go down to our local post office every day or two, and we say, hi there, anything, any mail for Stephen? And they would go take a look and say, oh yeah, here's one. And they would hold on to that and they'd say, yeah, you can have it, but you owe 38 cents, let's say. Really? Yeah, the recipient of the mail paid for the mail. Okay, so you had to go in there and buy your mail back before you could take it. Okay, now there were a number of people who refused to do it. No, I don't want it. Nope, That went into something called the dead letter file. Or if that mail wasn't collected for a long enough period of time, the postmaster might throw it in the dead letter file. And by the way, there were sometimes very important things and very precious things that showed up in dead letter files. But that's the way the post office worked. Now, I'll tell you about a trick. Now, it's not so much a trick anymore because we can't do it at the post office. But let's say that I would write a letter to Catherine, who you met, you heard her at the start of the program, or to Clint or Sarah or somebody from our staff at NC Library. I'd write them the letter, okay, and I'd send it off, and they had to pay for it when they received it. And it said, hi, how are you? Oh, by the way, I'd like to know that you're okay. Send the letter back to me, and I'll tell you what, when it gets to my post office, I won't accept it. But the mere fact that it showed up in the post office means you're okay. It's a secret way. So Catherine would send back a letter to me. And of course, if I went in the post office and I said, you got a letter from me? Yes, here's a letter from Catherine. I say, oh, that's great. Oh, you owe 42 cents. No, I don't want to throw it away. Put it in dead letter. But wait a minute. Do you know what Catherine wanted to say? What I know Catherine was telling me is what I said in my letter. Just send me a letter and I'll know you're okay. I'll know you received my letter. But I don't have to pay for the return letter. So the post offices understood that they were beginning to lose some money in this deal. And lo and behold, some smart person in the post office said, what if the sender has to pay part of this postage? What if we put a little something in the corner of the envelope that they have to buy when they're sending the letter, and we'll get some of our money right up front? And lo and behold, stamps were invented in the 1840s. Okay. Now, because mail was so reliable and really very cheap, people decided they could start to use mail for business ventures. And one of them that I love is not the business use so much, but the greeting card use. Think about that for a second. Why do we have greeting cards? We have greeting cards because we can get them back and forth with one another. Take a look at a bookshelf or something in your house right now. Do you not have Christmas cards already starting to be put out on a shelf? Well, how come that's possible? Post office makes that possible. Okay. The post offices and the mail service became so important, and people started writing so much to one another that all kinds of other things became important too, like those beautiful little wooden writing desks that sat on top of your table. You know, they had a slanted front. You pick it up and your writing supplies inside there, the pens and the colored inks and all that kind of stuff, the great paper. That became very important. But greeting cards became the rage in the middle of the 1800s. Okay. And one of the women a lady who got involved in the business very early, I'd like to tell you about. Her name is Esther Howland. And if you are interested in the history of Valentine cards, you will run across her name, because at the age of 19, she began to make some handmade Valentines because she received one in the mail. And she thought, oh, this is very clever, very cute. I can do this though, you know? So she made about 20 of them. And she took them down to her dad's store, which was a general store with some stationery stuff in it. And she said, put these out and see if anybody will buy them. And they went like hotcakes. And over the next couple of years, Esther started a business of greeting cards, especially Valentine's cards. She hired some gals in the neighborhood. A month or so before Valentine's Day, they started making Valentine's cards. They brought them down to Dad's store and they sold them out. And she made a nice penny for it. Okay. Now she thought to herself, why, if I can sell so many of these, and she was in a small town on the East Coast, if I can make so many of these and they sell so well, whoa, what would happen if I advertised these cards in the newspaper? And that's what she did. And the more cards she produced, the more she advertised, the more she sold them out. And over a period of about 40 years, she became a real mover and groover in the card business, until she finally sold her company in about 1890, I believe, for about $100,000, which in today's money, that would have been a pretty penny. Okay, so what about post offices? Well, this business is going so well, and more people are writing letters, and more people are beginning to use the post office for business things, private businesses rather than bank business and so forth. In 1860, at the opening, just before the opening of the Civil War, 28,000 post offices in our country. Okay, 240,000 miles of post road. So the things are just becoming so well established in terms of the post office. Let's look down a little bit here. So let's go to impact number 3. What about free speech protection? What's the post office got to do with that? Well, first of all, and I love this one, in 1810, one of the first cases to get to the court system about the post office was the Keep the Sabbath Holy case. Now, this was a church group, a very conservative church group, had Sunday services, and they were very, very concerned about the fact that at 10 o'clock in the morning, many of the men in the service would get up and leave. And where would they go? To the post office, because it opened on Sunday at 10 in the morning. Well, what in the world are all these guys doing at the post office? They're having a drink, because these post offices, you remember, are established in taverns. They're established in all kinds of public houses. And so they brought suit against the postal system, said you got to close post offices on Sunday so we can have our religious service. We have the right to freedom of religion. The court handed down the decree that no, you can't close the post office. You'll have to adjust the time of your service, or you'll have to take into consideration some way of being sure the men stay at the service. Okay? In Charlotte, now let's move up a few years from 1810 to 1835. In Charleston, rather, South Carolina, that beautiful little post office that we saw at the start of our program here became the scene of a very ugly event. At that time, a lot of abolitionist literature, you know, the anti-slavery literature, primarily from northern and middle colony folks in states, was making its way into the South. How? Through the mail. And in Charleston, South Carolina, one night, people broke into the post office because the postmaster would not throw that mail away. He put it into the mail slots of everybody that was intended to get the mail. And they broke in and pulled all the abolitionist mail out of the post office and started a huge bonfire and burned it all in front of the post office. And they did that periodically because the federal government would not stop the mailing of that mail into the South. And so the abolitionist mailings continued to go regularly, although in many, many post offices, they were met either by the local postmaster, who was a federal employee, so he was putting his job on the line, would remove the literature from the mail, but the post office would not censor the mail. It was allowed to go through. And even today, there's limited censorship, even though you and I might say, I wish, we would censor more of some of the junk that's coming through the mail. But that's our job as consumers. It's not the post office's job to censor that mail. Let's go to impact 4, affordable mail. And there's our stagecoach again. Now, in the late 1800s, we had some problems with the mail. The Congress of the United States said, post office, you cannot have a deficit. You must pay for your budget. You can't borrow money to run the post office. You got to pay for it through postal rates. So stamps were initiated in the 1840s to begin to create revenue, but then some other practices were stopped. For example, where a stagecoach would leave, you notice all the passengers aboard that stagecoach. There's maybe 8 of them sitting on top and inside and all the rest of that kind of thing. People would flock to the stagecoach to where it was leaving from, and they would give their mail to these passengers and say, "Hey, are you going up to Denver? Well, here, take this and drop it off, and I'll pay you a quarter for that." It would have cost you maybe 75 cents by the post office, but this passenger will do it for a quarter. Now, I don't know if you could guarantee your letter would get there. It might be hurled out the window somewhere over Kansas or going through Kansas. But that system had to be stopped. And the post office worked to stop that kind of system from undermining the revenue that they were getting for sending the mail by stagecoach. Also, the spoil system. If you knew somebody in government, you could give them a couple of bucks and they might send a postal contract your way. You might not do the job very well, but you knew the guy and you got it under the spoil system. That was cut out by competitive contract in the late 1800s. Big to do about that, by the way, in a lot of legislation and law. And there were some better ideas. For example, let's cut rates. Let's use competitive contracts. Make these people bid against one another to get the contract to carry it on their stage service. Okay? And Congress finally came around and said, look, the post office probably can't pay its own way all the time and still keep rates low. So we will accept a deficit from year to year by the post office. And look what happened by keeping the rates low. 24 million letters were mailed in 1843. And 7 years later, the number was up to 62 million because of the ability to keep rates affordable for you and I. Great impact. Okay, now I'm gonna roll a little bit here. I get to be a little chatty during these presentations because we want to leave some time for questioning. Impact number 4 or 5 rather. Geography is not going to stop the Postal Service. Okay, that was one of the tenets. Okay, come rain, snow, whatever the case may be, but also geography won't change it. Now, we had to get the mail from the East Coast to the West Coast and vice versa. Before the Transcontinental Railroad, the railroad that ran from the Mississippi to California, okay, we only had 2 ways to do it. Put it on a ship, sail it around the tip of South America and up to California, or vice versa. Or sail it to Panama, put it on a little train, carry it across the Isthmus of Panama, put it on another ship, and take it up to California. Each of those 2 were very, very time consuming. And so, but the mail would make it from one side to the other. So then, to break that down so it wouldn't have to stay on boat, but could be transferred by land, the stagecoach, the Pony Express, and the railroads and steamships were all supported by post office contract. So that when we hear about stagecoaches going across the Great Plains or the Pony Express, those operated on post office money. Okay, they needed those contracts to stay alive. All right. Now, I love this. Abby and I did a program, oh geez, a couple of years ago now on the Pony Express. And I'm going to read to you the ad. This is, the Pony Express was pretty short-lived. Within 2 years, it was started and stopped, actually. So here's the way they looked for Pony Express riders. And see if you'd like to maybe apply for a Pony Express job. Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred. And I kid you not, that's an ad that appeared in the newspapers to get Pony Express riders. Okay? Now, down at the bottom of the page, I mentioned parcel post. In 1913, let's say we wanted to move a package from one place in the country to the other. Could we do it cheaply? We certainly could with the invention of parcel post in 1913, the movement of packages back and forth, okay? And if you look at this picture, you're gonna find two packages. And you won't believe this, but when parcel post was first put into operation, in that first year, 2 people in our country mailed kids to someone else in the country. All right. The first one was Jimmy Beagle. You see the little 2-year-old is sitting in the pouch of the mail van right there. He was sent by parcel post about a mile from grandma's house back to the house of his parents. I'm not sure yet to this day what the motivation behind that was. But if you look at the picture of Charlotte Purestorm, okay, the 6-year-old in the bottom left-hand corner, very, very cute little girl. She was mailed 75 miles in Idaho on the train, the railroad train car. In parcel post, her parents paid for her to go parcel post to grandma's house in another part of Idaho. So they took her by wagon to the train station. The train master, or the station master, put her on the postal car. She was held on a chair in the postal car, dropped off in grandma's town, where grandma and grandpa picked her up. Now, why did they do that? Well, her parents were experimenting with the idea that she could travel to see grandma cheaper through parcel post than she could by buying a seat on the train. Well, it didn't take quite a year, and the federal government closed down that use of parcel post. Now, parcel post was tested in another way, and I always giggle about this because I love to do home chores, and I was in the construction business a little bit as a teacher in the summertime. But a fellow by the name of Colharp, a Utah contractor, he owned a company, and he got a contract to build a bank building. And so he wanted to send his bricks from his building, his headquarters, to where the bank was going to be built. So he had to send 80,000 bricks, about 400 miles. Now, what do you think he thought would be the best way to send those bricks 400 miles? Yeah, parcel post. And so they put them on a train car. And it wasn't soon after that, or wasn't long after that the federal government passed legislation that said that there would be a limit on parcel post of 200 pounds per customer per day. And Mr. Coulthard had to find another way to move bricks around Utah from contract to contract. All right, impact 6. How about prompt delivery? Post office will get your stuff there when necessary. Well, because post offices seem to be spending a lot of time sorting mail, back in 1864, something was invented by the post office that is was very, very important. It was the railroad post office. Okay, the railroad post office is a railroad car converted into a post office that's linked up onto a train. And inside that car are postal clerks who sort mail as it moves from a major site, like let's say from Philadelphia to Chicago. And as that car is moving along, it may stop in Akron, or no, I'll have to get my towns, in Cincinnati and so forth. And the mail from, let's say, Philadelphia to Cincinnati would be sorted on the train car. And so it'd be sorted in a few hours and be ready to be dropped off at the Cincinnati post office when the train arrived in Cincinnati, rather than it having to be transported by wagon or steamboat or anything else. Okay, so because there was that so much time, the train cars were added to the trains. The rate of sorting, this I thought was really, really cute. In order to be a clerk, you had to be able to sort 10 pieces of mail every minute. And from the reports we get, these people in those clerks in those train cars kept up that rate for almost the entire length of the trip. Now, that job became the most dangerous in the post office's list of jobs. Why? Because of crashes. These were pretty flimsy cars. Railroad crashes were prominent. They were often. And when one train piled into another, the car that most often collapsed was the post office car. So these guys were always facing that problem. Robbers, train robbers, the robbery of post office cars, especially in the West, was rampant. And so often one of these clerks was armed and would have to kind of, negotiate with the robber. No, you're not going to get the mail out up here. You're going to, and that was a very, very dangerous kind of thing. And then hooks. Sometimes these cars would not stop at a station. The mail would be dropped off. A sack would be hung on the front of the mail car. It would be hooked off as it went through the station by a hook at the station house. And then the mail going out would be on another post, and these railroad workers would hook it with a big iron hook and swing it aboard the car. The trains would never stop. Okay, those jobs, those operations all made that a very, very dangerous job. But it signified how much the post office wanted to keep prompt delivery so that the advantages of our postal system could be protected year in and year out. All right, free city delivery. Here we'll get into the modern era, 1862. Civil War, a free city delivery. Cleveland, the postmaster in Cleveland wanted to run an experiment. Instead of everybody coming into the post office, what if we addressed, put numbers on houses, and we put clear names on streets, and we could deliver the mail directly to house. Put a little mailbox on the door. Put something out in front of the house. We can do it that way, and you don't have to come down to the post office. Now, there was an ulterior motive. In 1862, the Civil War was in full bore. And people who were going to receive communications from the War Department about a lost loved one would have to go down to the post office to pick up that mail, remember. And very often they would get that very official looking piece of mail, and they would learn about the loss of a loved one there in the midst of a crowd in the post office. And this fellow, the postmaster in Cleveland, said, can't we kind of blunt that emotion a little bit? And came up with this idea. Well, of course, that also meant there had to be more jobs, right? There had to be mail carriers now. And so after the Civil War, uh, veterans of the war were hired, freed slaves were hired often, and women found their way into the postal system as clerks, mostly, right after the Civil War. And I want to tell you about one of them in just a second. A post letter carrier at that time, if you were curious about it, would usually have to hike about 12 miles a day to get that mail delivered in the city. Now, this did not mean rural. Farmers did not have this. Suburbanites, although there were no real suburbs, but small towns did not get it. It was only in the city where this system was available. And I want to tell you about Vinnie Ream. Vinnie Ream is a woman hired, a young girl hired by the post office when her and her family moved to Washington, D.C. Now, Vinnie, Lavinia, gets infatuated with clay. She sees a sculptor working in clay almost immediately upon getting to Washington, D.C., and she starts taking lessons with this artist. And within just about a year, she gets a meeting with President Lincoln. And she says to the president, "I'm pretty good at this sculpting thing. I would like to make a statue of you." And he says, "Really? Okay, why don't you come in at lunchtimes and make some drawings and do some stuff, and we'll see what this all turns out." Well, Vinnie worked for about 3 or 4 years on the project. She did the clay work. The Congress was then asked if they would fund making a statue based on her clay work of President Lincoln. And they said, yeah. And in 1864, well, that's Lincoln posing, she became the youngest artist and the first woman to get a congressional commission for a piece of artwork to be placed in the Capitol building. And in 1871, the Lincoln statue that is in the Capitol building to this day was returned to the United States from Italy, where it was done in marble based on her rendition. Okay. And at this time, it was placed in the Capitol building. Vinnie was 23 years old. An amazing story, isn't it? Now, well, good thing for women artists. Look at how important it's going to be. Well, Vinnie only lasted in the arts as an artist for about 4 or 5 more years because her husband was dead set on women making a living, and he insisted that she stop being an artist. But she does have her sculpture in the Capitol building, so that's not too bad of a kind of an initiation. All because she could get, well, not only because, but she became prominent in DC because she was a postal worker, moved there with her family. Now, Impact 6. We're serving the city folks by giving them mailboxes, but what about our rural friends out in the countryside? Well, of course, 1902 came the rural free delivery. If you city folks can get mail to your house, let's deliver the mail to our rural friends also, okay? Why was that developed? Why was Congress interested in sending the post office out into the rural areas and delivering the mail right to the farmhouse? Because they didn't want farmers to be moving off of their farms. It was a time when industry was becoming very, very prevalent. People were moving to the cities to take industrial jobs, and there was a great worry that food production would fall off. And so Congress said, whoa, wait a minute. Let's deliver mail right to our rural friends, and we'll try to cut the tide of people moving into the cities. But of course, as soon as rural free delivery started, what came with it? A bunch of things. Mail order catalogs. I don't think any of us, well, I don't know. I shouldn't speak for everybody. I remember every Christmas getting my wish book from the Sears company. Okay, that's that winter catalog. I remember getting my very stiff Levi's from Sears. Every year, my mom would buy them through the catalog. So Sears and Montgomery Wards took quick advantage of the rural free delivery. The trains delivered the packages from Chicago primarily, where Montgomery Ward's and Sears was located with their central warehouses, kind of the early Amazon, went out by train, picked up at the railroad stations by the post office, and delivered free of charge, small delivery fee actually, to the rural people. Okay? Along with that came the spread of magazines to the rural countryside via the post office also, as did advertisements. Now, one of the fascinating things about that, if you think about it, is this big divide. Remember, we used to refer to people out on the rural side, hayseeds, kind of derogatory terms like that. Now we have an opportunity, we have the tools to begin to blend Americans all over, no matter where their residence is, into more homogeneous group, because they can be reading the same advertisements, they can be getting the same products, they can be reading the newspapers, they can be getting the magazines and reading the same fiction. They're going to become Americans by way of rural free delivery. They'll be reading the same stuff, those city folks. They'll be seeing the same pictures. They'll be wearing the same clothing. In fact, from Sears, you could get all kinds of cool stuff. Look at this. In 1905, just before the Pure Food and Drug Act comes in, you could buy your Bayer aspirins from Sears. Now, by the way, Bayer aspirins, were loaded with opium. And so you could get your opium deliveries through the Sears catalog right to your doorstep. The Sears catalog had about 50 pages of patent medicines, all the way up until the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in the early 1900s, when all that kind of huckster medicine was finally tossed out. You could also become an optician. Buy your optician's kit. You buy an eye chart, you buy a bunch of lenses from Sears, you bring your patient in, you sit them down, they read the chart, you put some lenses in front. Can you read it better with this? Good, that's a number 7. You write back to Sears and give me some glasses with number 7 lenses in them. Sears sends them back to you, you sell them to your patient. You're an optician. Okay? A few other things that you could do through the Sears catalog. You could buy your opium, as I said. You could buy your arsenic-laced women's face cream with arsenic in it. You could buy live chickens and chicks for your backyard. You could buy hair wigs. You could buy, let me run down here. You could send a picture of someone to Sears and they would hand paint it into a portrait. So it's in the 1960s and send it back to you for about $70 each. You could buy an entire house through the Sears catalog. The plans, all the pre-cut lumber, everything would be delivered to your house, to your lot. You would put it together for about $1,700, all the way up to 1940. Okay?
Excuse me, Bill, just so you know, you've got about 16 minutes left.
Boy, am I going to talk fast.
Well, and we need some Q&A in there if we can. But
okay, good. And I've only got, I think, about 4 or 5 slides.
Okay.
So I want to talk about one more impact in a little bit of depth, and that was to support the post office had with new technologies. You see that airplane in the picture here. It's an old 2-winger airplane, and its nose is stuck in the ground. Why? Because they weren't exactly the safest airplane to fly. But the post office was the first to introduce airmail. Okay? It was not flown by the Army. The Army tried, but didn't do very well at it. So the post office began to fly airmail in the early 1900s. And of the first 40 pilots that the post office employed to fly airmail, 31 of them died in crashes. And so the early flights were disastrous. They were flying from airports with no lights. They had no navigational equipment. There were no maps to choose from, no radar. They flew low enough so they could follow a road from one town to one city to the next. When it got nighttime, Or when it got foggy or rainy or stormy, they had to land in a farmer's field and wait for it all to pass. They would take off and try to make it to the next city. It was horrible, but all of those early years were paid for by the post office until the technologies were developed to make these safer. And then the post office bought them. They bought the technologies to put spotlights in airports, to put more instruments in the airplanes. They did all kinds of things to improve the safety of those flights, to the point where commercial aviation, beginning to fly bigger airplanes, began to ask the post office for contracts to carry the mail. So what we know of as airmail in the big airplanes in the earlier 1900s all began because of post office pilots that were flying these simple airplanes that we saw here. So that technology was being supported by the post office and then used by commercial aviation later. World War II, a test of the post office was to get mail to and from the front. During the Revolutionary War, Friends carried mail back and forth. But by the time World War I came around, we had field postal stations called APOs. The Navy had them also. By World War II, the war area found about 1,000 APO post offices at the scene of the combat. In World War II, there was so much mail that the post office experimented with putting mail on microfilm, then sending the microfilm overseas where it could be printed out again, instead of trying to cover or carry that huge load of mail back and forth. And of course, in the Gulf War, and since, the post office has helped maintain an email system for the troopers. Now, I want to take you to the last slide here about how good can it get. And you see that postcard there. Would you believe that as far back as the 1800s, the early 1800s, some German and American scientists were experimenting with putting mail on the front end of a rocket and sending it from place to place. In the United States, there were experiments flying it from New York City into New Jersey over the river. Rocket would take off, it would crash in New Jersey. They would try to get the mail out of the wreckage, trying to experiment. Well, I think it was 1959, probably the most important experiment that was carried on. It involved taking a missile on the USS submarine Barbaro, taking the nuclear warhead off the front of it and putting a mail container on it. Sending it about 2,200 miles off the coast of Florida to a Florida base and crashing it down on the ground at the Naval Air Station there. It worked. And that was seen as a possibility to really speed things up in the future. Well, as you and I would probably counsel them, it's going to be a little costly to send one of those every time you want to send a mail. So what's going to happen next with the post office? Somebody talked to me the other day when we were doing this presentation. They said, well, Amazon's going to take it over. Or no, they won't. Everybody is fearful that if a private company took over the mail, the company went out of business, we'd have no mail. So for the foreseeable future, until something really drastic happens in technology, we will be able to rely on the Postal Service. So the next time you go into your post office or the postmaster comes by, I'd say tip your hat and say hi to them. And you might want to make them aware a little of the great history that they've inherited. Here's the book that Catherine mentioned before. It's called How the Post Office Created America. Winifred Gallagher's book, a lot more detail and really a well-told story, fun to listen to. And it's available through our library, and enjoy it. So I will be happy to take comments or questions if there's anybody left and anybody still awake. So fire away questions.
Thank you, Bill. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Sarah's lined up. Do you have any questions, Sarah?
I do not see any so far. I do just want to go ahead and note that if you are unsure of how to access the chat or I'm not sure what to call it, how to unmute yourself, you are not able to. So if you're trying to unmute yourself, just raise your hand and I can do that for you.
And we have to be able to see them though. Can we see everyone?
Yes, I'm monitoring the participants here and someone is over on YouTube also keeping track of that, the viewers there. In the meantime, I don't see any questions, but what got you started doing these histories, mysteries, and how do you choose the titles you're going to sort of, or the topics you're going to talk about?
Well, about 3 or 4, well, like I say, I was a teacher for about 50 years. And I was disappointed that we were not hooking kids on history. And I thought it was always because we were making it too bland, just a list of facts. You know, remember these dates, remember these names, that kind of thing. And so in my classroom, what we tried to do is I tried to bring the much bigger picture, and I let them try to explore. I was always enamored by a statement made by Samuel Clemens when he talked about who was there? No. He was talking about one of his characters who was living on the Mississippi River, saying that, why didn't Huck Finn go to school more? Huck didn't like school. And Huck said, I don't want to go to school because I can't pull the tail on the cat. Huck wanted to have more exploration. He wanted to see how it really worked. He wanted to pull the tail on the cat. And so what I did in my classroom for years is open this up to exploration. We always used a number of topics that the students could explore and bring what they found. And we would lace it all together into stories like we went through today. And then about 3 years ago, my wife and I are frequent visitors to Ireland, and we love to spend time with some friends of ours who are Irish storytellers. And it's magical. Sitting by an open hearth fire and just talking, they would be telling stories about their heritage and so forth. And I don't know why that wouldn't work with us here in America. And so we began to experiment with that style of bringing historical stories to people. And we started that about 3 or 4 years ago. And Abby and I, over a nice hot cup of coffee, we'll just brainstorm a bunch of ideas. We'll go through the North Carolina Library's list of books to see if there's anything about those topics. We'll explore them and we'll start putting together the presentations.
Thank you for that insight. I haven't seen any questions, but I have seen a couple of comments about how fascinating the program is.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Catherine. But before I do just want to let everyone know that you can still sign up for winter reading for adults and kids. You can email us at nclvph@ncdcr.gov, and the information is also going to be on your screen.
I did see a question on the screen that somebody typed in. Would you want me to respond to it?
Yes, please, please.
They just wanted to know where I taught. I taught in a suburb outside of Chicago, St. Charles, and in Dundee. And then I helped the governor start the governor's school for math and science. And I taught there for a number of years until I came down here to North Carolina. And I taught at a private school in North Carolina in my last couple of years before retirement.
Awesome.
We also have a raised hand. Do you see that?
Oh, I do. Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. Can you list or name some of the greatest challenges that the post office may currently face in the short-term, long-term future as far as its survival and solvency? And I'll take that answer off of the panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for asking that question.
I have
I think if I could do a good job of that, I would probably want to go ahead and talk to somebody in government and say, hire me as a consultant. But what I do know is, as I watch the political scene, we are going to have to figure out what to do with mail-in ballots. And so that's going to be a challenge to be sure the security of that is protected. But enough about the politics of it. I think the rising costs of things are going to have to be controlled. And the mobility of us as a people, we still continue to move frequently, in fact, probably faster than ever. A system of staying in contact will have to be protected. But I'll tell you, I have been delighted in North Carolina with the professionalism of the post office system here in Charlotte. I also like a feature like when I go out of town for a few days, on a speaking tour or something. Something as simple as that, I think is a wonderful feature. But I think we have to be sure we don't get trapped into giving up the post office for a quick corporate fix. Well, we can deliver this a lot faster. We have a bigger warehouse and we can do it with less employees. We can keep the cost down. That's fine. But a private company can go out of business. And when that happens, we have to be sure the post office is still there to perform that vital function it has for what, over 400 years? Or 300 years?
It's been quite a long time for sure.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and Bill, I noticed that your mic was on. Did you have a quick question? Very, very brief. Or is
I was going to ask about can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Okay.
Yes,
I
we can.
was going to ask you about the voting and the mail-in ballots. I was a poll worker in Pennsylvania for over 50 years. And well aware absentee ballots, and as far as I'm concerned, mail-in ballots are the same thing. And I think it's ludicrous not to accept them. And I think we've learned a lot this year about how to use absentee ballots. So I think that the whole concept is beautiful, and I thought you need a whole slide to add it onto your presentation for that. Other than that, the presentation was excellent.
Thank you very much. I think I'll hand a challenge out to you. You and I are going to get together over a cup of coffee, and we're going to put one of those presentations together.
I'd love to try.
All right.
okay? Thank you again, everyone, for your questions. Catherine, over to you.
Okay, well, I just want to thank Bill so much. This is just fascinating. And I had heard some of what you were talking about earlier, and I think about it a lot, actually, every time the mail gets delivered to my house. And in fact, it was delivered while you were speaking. And the great thing is I'm using it to send out free matter to some of our patrons. They're mailing labels and boxes. So even at my own house, I'm able to serve the Library for the Blind because of my postal carriers. So anyway, I think about that thanks to you. So
One last comment. When I was young, we had 2 deliveries a day. Now we have 1 a day. And I guess that's a volume thing.
Yeah, I am aware of that same thing, that the frequency of deliveries is cut down a little bit. But that's because I think that the volume, as you said, the volume of mail has been cut back too, because we're emailing so much and other kinds of things, that there's probably not the necessity to have that second delivery. So I would guess that's the answer. I could look into that a little more. And if we get together again in a month or two, I'll see if I can't have a little better answer for that.
great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Bill. And thank you everyone for coming and joining us on our very first virtual program. All right, well, thank you. I guess we'll end it now.
All righty. Catherine, we're gonna have a chance to chat a little bit, maybe tomorrow or something. An email or-
Absolutely. We can sure do that. Yes.
That'd be great. I'd love to get some feedback.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
All right, everybody, take care.
Thanks, you too.